He came to repair the widow's roof, but he didn't expect to see what had been hidden in the attic for many years. What he found turned her life upside down. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Marina Levina had lived in the old country house for almost 8 months, yet she still felt like a stranger wandering through someone else's memories. The place had belonged to her late husband's family for generations, a peculiar structure of gray timber and sagging beams, built long before modern building codes and sensible layouts. It creaked at night, and the wind inside its walls often sounded like voices passing through a narrow corridor. She told herself it was only age, wood shrinking and expanding with the cold, but there were nights when the sounds felt too deliberate and too soft to be explained by nature. Her son, 7-year-old Artyom, refused to sleep alone ever since they had moved in. He clung to her each evening with an almost desperate certainty, whispering that he didn't like the noises upstairs, that the ceiling talked at night, and that sometimes it sounded like footsteps, pacing in slow circles above his room. Marina soothed him with gentle hands and tired words, reminding him that houses made noises because they were alive in their own way. But deep down, she felt a tightening in her chest whenever the child spoke of the upper floor. She had her own uneasiness about the attic. The house had endured many winters, but this winter had been particularly harsh. Snow piled knee-deep, freezing the earth beneath it, and the roof, already weary from decades of neglect, began to sag in the center. Cold air seeped into the rooms through hair-thin cracks, and the upstairs hallway smelled faintly of dust and something older, something almost sweet and stale. Her husband had refused to let anyone touch the attic when he was alive, insisting that the beams were fragile and that any unnecessary disturbance might collapse the inner structure. He never offered a proper explanation and brushed off her questions with an abrupt change of subject. But now he was gone, buried on a quiet hillside 3 towns away, and the house belonged solely to Marina and the boy. She had no choice but to face the problems he left behind. When she noticed a patch of wet ceiling in the corner of Artyom's room, she finally called for help. She needed a professional, someone careful and trustworthy, someone who wouldn't judge her for letting the house age into disrepair. That was how she met Gennady Sergeyevich Aumann, whose calm, steady presence contrasted sharply with the anxious energy she carried inside. He arrived early in the morning, his boots heavy with old mud, and his coat smelling faintly of sawdust. He was in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, missing the hurriedness of younger workers. He moved deliberately, inspecting every corner slowly, as though listening to what the house itself wanted to tell him. Marina followed quietly, hugging her arms against the cold as she explained the issues she had noticed. The roof, she said, felt wrong. It groaned even when the wind was still, and she could feel the temperature shift as soon as she climbed the staircase. Gennady nodded, humming under his breath as he surveyed the ceiling. He tapped beams with his knuckles, pressed palms against walls, studying the patterns in the wood grain. Strange, he murmured more to himself than to her, leaning closer to a crooked section of plaster. Looks like someone closed something up here, years ago. Marina frowned. Closed what? He shrugged. Hard to say. It wasn't until he climbed the ladder to the attic that the atmosphere truly changed. Marina watched from below as he pushed open the hatch and pulled himself through, disappearing into the dim space above. Dust showered down from the frame, and she heard his heavy boots shift across the boards. For a long moment, there were only sounds of him inspecting. Steps, soft grunts, a shift of timber. Then there was silence, a thick, heavy silence. Marina called up to him, her voice cracking slightly, as she asked if everything was all right. The reply came late, delayed enough to make her hands tighten into fists. Marina, Gennady finally said, his tone unfamiliar, as though caught between disbelief and caution. "You need to come see this." She hesitated. Something inside her recoiled, telling her not to go up there, not to step into the dimness that had unsettled her for months. But curiosity and unease pushed her forward. She climbed the ladder slowly, feeling each rung tremble beneath her weight. When her head rose above the attic floor, she inhaled instinctively, surprised by the sudden cold. The attic was larger than she had imagined, its beams crisscrossing overhead like the ribs of some enormous wooden beast. Flakes of old insulation littered the floor, and broken boxes lay collapsed in the corners. She expected nothing more than disarray, but then she saw it. A white wall-reel wood, old paint peeling in long vertical strips, standing in the center of the attic as though someone had built the front of a tiny house right under the roof. For a moment, Marina could not breathe. It looked surreal, impossible. A miniature house facade rose from the dust, complete with a triangular gable, a small rectangular door, and the faint outline of a window long painted shut. It looked as though it had once stood outdoors, exposed to weather and wind, but now it sat hidden inside the attic, swallowed by darkness. "What is that?" she whispered. Gennady shook his head. "I don't know. But it's not an accident. Someone built this deliberately. The beams around it were adjusted to make space." She touched the structure with trembling fingers. The wood was cold, older than the rest of the attic, its texture rough like bark. A thin shiver ran along her spine. There was something unsettlingly familiar about it, though she couldn't explain why. "My husband never said anything," she murmured. "He barely let me come up here. He always said it wasn't safe." Gennady tapped the facade lightly, listening to the hollow echo behind it. "It's empty inside," he said. "But there's a room, a real room." The words didn't make sense. A room inside the attic, built like a house within a house? She leaned closer to the door, noticing the handle. Small, child-sized, too low to be intended for an adult. She felt a sudden prickling at the back of her neck, a creeping sensation that something was terribly wrong. Memories of her husband's evasiveness drifted through her mind, his refusal to discuss his past, his aversion to questions about his childhood, his insistence that certain parts of the house should remain untouched. At the time, she had accepted it as a quirk of personality, an odd preference shaped by an upbringing he never spoke of. Now she wondered whether the silence had been deliberate, not to protect the house, but to hide something inside it. "Open it," she said quietly. Gennady crouched, prying gently at the edge of the door until it creaked open. A breath of stale, trapped air escaped from the darkness within. Marina felt her heartbeat quicken as she peered inside. She expected emptiness, a hollow space, maybe some forgotten junk. Instead, she saw the faint outline of furniture. A small bed with a wooden frame, a shelf lined with dusty books, a table with a single wooden chair. Everything was miniaturized, child-sized, like a tiny bedroom crafted decades earlier and then sealed away. Marina stepped inside, feeling the oppressive weight of the air, heavy with time and abandonment. Dust coated every surface, but nothing seemed disturbed. It was as though the room had been deserted abruptly, left untouched since the day it was sealed shut. The bed's blanket, once patterned with blue stripes, was faded to gray. On the shelf sat wooden toys worn smooth from tiny hands. Near the far wall, a paper notebook lay half open, its pages curled with age. She reached toward it, hesitating at the sight of childish handwriting covering the exposed page. The lines were shaky, uneven, written by someone who had not yet mastered the steadiness of letters. She lifted the notebook gently. Written across the page were 4 words. He said he'd return. A surge of cold swept through her body. Her fingers tightened around the notebook. Gennady watched her, his expression sober. "Someone lived here," he said. "For a long time." Marina swallowed. Her thoughts tumbled in panicked disorder. How could this be here, inside her home? How could her husband have never spoken of it? She tried to reason, to force some explanation that didn't feel monstrous, but every possibility dissolved under the weight of the quiet room around her. She set the notebook down with trembling hands. "We need to look at everything," she said. The room seemed to watch her, its stillness unnerving. She stepped back out into the attic, feeling the trembling in her legs. A low creak echoed somewhere behind the beams, sharp, sudden, almost like a step. Marina froze. Her eyes darted upward, but she saw nothing except shadows sliding gently across the ceiling as the wind moved outside. Gennady asked if she had heard something. She shook her head too quickly. She didn't want to admit it. She didn't want to voice the growing dread building inside her chest. Instead, she inhaled deeply, telling herself she was imagining things, and forced her gaze back to the small white house tucked beneath the rafters. Whatever secrets this attic held, whatever truth her husband had buried, she felt certain they were only at the beginning of uncovering it. The discovery had cracked open something ancient and silent, and now that silence had begun to stir. Marina stood in the attic long after Gennady began clearing space around the small white structure. The dim light filtering through the narrow vents cast uneven shadows across the miniature house facade, making it appear almost alive, breathing in the cold stillness. Her fingers still tingled from touching the weathered notebook inside the small room, as though the lingering presence of its long-gone occupant clung to her skin. She could not shake the hollow feeling that had settled deep inside her, nor the strange sensation that she had stepped into a story already in progress, one that her late husband had desperately tried to bury. The discovery unsettled her more than she was ready to admit. There was something unnatural about a small, fully furnished room hidden inside an attic, something haunting in its careful arrangement. She kept replaying the phrase scribbled across the notebook page, the shaky letters heavy with yearning. He said he'd return. Who had promised to return? And to whom? Marina tried to push the questions aside, but they gnawed at her thoughts with persistent urgency. She had always known her husband carried shadows he never fully shared, memories that flickered through his eyes during sleepless nights. But she had never imagined anything like this, an entire secret room built for a child, sealed away and left untouched for decades. Standing in the dim attic, she suddenly felt as though she had never really known the man she shared a home and a son with. Gennady's steady footsteps approached behind her, his presence a grounding force in the suffocating stillness. He rubbed dust from his gloves and looked at her with quiet concern. "This wasn't built recently," he said, gesturing toward the tiny doorway. "The materials, the paint, the way the beams were cut. It must have been done a very long time ago. Someone went to great lengths to hide it." Marina nodded slowly, though the words barely penetrated the haze of thought swirling inside her. She needed answers, and the only way to find them was to look deeper. Taking a slow breath, she stepped toward the small doorway and once again entered the room, determined to explore every inch of it. The air inside was colder than the rest of the attic, as if time itself had frozen the moment the door had been sealed. Marina felt as though she were trespassing into someone's forgotten childhood, an unspoken grief ingrained in every object she touched. She approached the bed first. The blanket, thin and faded, had small frayed corners where fingers might have tugged in restless sleep. She could not help but imagine a child lying there, listening to footsteps in the house above, waiting, always, waiting for someone who never came. The thought made her chest tighten. She turned her attention to the shelves. Books with crumbling spines leaned against each other, some filled with childish scribbles, others with incomplete stories or erratic drawings. Marina leafed through a few pages, her eyes catching small details. A sketch of a boy standing next to someone taller, perhaps an older brother. A picture of a house that looked strikingly similar to the one they were standing in. A set of uneven stick figures with sad, downturned eyes. On another shelf, she found a wooden horse carved roughly by hand, its edges worn by time. Marina ran her fingers along the smooth surface, imagining tiny hands gripping it, seeking comfort in the only toy they might have had. Her heart ached with an emotion she could not yet name. She moved next to the small table. A cup lay overturned, its bottom coated in a fine layer of dust. A scrap of paper rested beside it, folded neatly despite its brittle texture. She opened it carefully, revealing a single line written in faint pencil. "He didn't come today." Her breath caught in her throat. She read it again, as if the sentence might change on the second reading. But it remained the same, a quiet, heartbreaking certainty. Someone had waited in this room, day after day, counting footsteps overhead, waiting for someone they trusted deeply, and that someone had not returned. A deep unease settled within her, pushing her to continue. At the foot of the bed, she noticed a shallow indentation in the floorboards, as though a chair had once scraped there repeatedly. She crouched down and brushed away dust, revealing more carvings in the wood lines, etched in clusters of 5, repeating hundreds of times. Days, months, perhaps even years accounted for in silent tally marks. She closed her eyes, momentarily overcome. Gennady appeared at the doorway, his face shadowed by concern. "This child lived here for a long time," he said quietly. "No doubt about it." Marina nodded, swallowing hard. "But who was he?" Her voice trembled. "And why did my husband never speak of him?" The question lingered unanswered between them. Marina felt that if she stayed in the tiny room any longer, she would drown in its sorrow. She rose slowly and stepped out into the attic, trying to gather her breath, her thoughts, her strength. But even after she left the space, she felt the weight of that lonely childhood following her. When she descended the ladder and reached the hallway, she felt disoriented. The familiar house seemed changed, as though every hallway now led to questions she did not want to ask. She leaned against the wall, pressing the heel of her palm against her forehead. It was then she remembered something, a faint whisper from her past. Her husband had once mentioned having a brother. It was a fleeting mention, something said late at night when he thought she was half asleep. She had assumed he meant a distant cousin or family friend. He never spoke of him again. Marina drew a shaky breath. The memory felt heavy now, suspiciously vague, as if it had been concealed behind years of silence. She needed answers, and the attic alone could not provide them. She decided to do what her husband had always refused to do, ask the town's older residents about his childhood. It was a small village, and people talked sometimes too much, sometimes not enough. But the elderly remembered everything. Marina bundled herself in a scarf and coat, ignoring the sting of cold air that seeped through the cracks of the front door. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she walked toward the lane where several of the oldest neighbors lived. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of more snow. The wind carried a low whistle as she trudged forward, her heart pounding with the urgency of someone who had stumbled onto a truth long hidden. Her first stop was Mrs. Karatonova, a woman well into her 80s who rarely left her window seat. Marina knocked softly, and the older woman welcomed her inside with a cautious smile. As Marina warmed her hands near the stove, she gently asked whether the family who once lived in her house had any children. The old woman's expression changed almost immediately. Something dark flickered behind her eyes. "Yes," she said. "2 of them. Twin boys. Marina felt the world tilt slightly. Twins? Identical, the woman replied. Or so I remember. But one of them, he disappeared. People said he was taken away. Others said he died. Nobody ever spoke clearly about it. The parents were very strict, strange people. Marina leaned closer, her pulse accelerating. Do you remember anything else? Anything unusual? The woman hesitated, her fingers tightening around her teacup. Sometimes, she said slowly, we heard crying from that house. At night, not baby crying, older, soft, like someone didn't want to be heard. Marina felt cold crawl along her spine. And the father, the woman continued, lowering her voice, always went upstairs carrying food. Never let anyone inside. After a while, the crying stopped. These fragments sank into Marina like stones, dropped into deep water. Pieces of a puzzle she had never known existed were beginning to surface, and they painted a picture more distressing than anything she could have imagined. But she needed more. She thanked the woman and continued visiting neighbors, gathering bits of information. One man remembered seeing one of the boys less often as the years passed. Another recalled that the children were rarely seen playing outside, unlike other children in the village. Someone else mentioned hearing rumors of an illness, though no doctor had ever been seen visiting the house. The more Marina asked, the clearer it became. There had been 2 boys, but one of them had vanished not suddenly, but gradually fading from sight, like a candle flame dimming behind a closed curtain. Her husband had never mentioned a twin, never spoken of losing a brother, never shared any part of that childhood. And now Marina understood why. On her way back home, Marina's breath fogged the air before her, each exhale sharp and quick. The snow seemed deeper, the road longer, the world heavier. Artyom watched her from the front window when she returned, his face pressed against the cold glass. When she stepped inside, he ran to her and hugged her tightly. "Mama," he murmured. The house was making noises again. Marina shivered. What kind of noises? Artyom frowned. Steps, slow ones, like someone small was walking. She held him close, her heart thudding loudly. She wanted to dismiss his words, to tell him it was only wind or settling beams. But after what she had seen in the attic, she could not bring herself to lie. Instead, she kissed his head and told him everything would be all right, though she felt far from certain. That night, after putting Artyom to bed, Marina sat alone in the living room, the notebook from the attic resting on her lap. She traced her fingers over the faded words again and again. He said he'd return. The pages seemed to whisper their own stories, filling the quiet of the house with a sorrow she had no defense against. She turned the pages slowly, reading fragments written in shaky lines. Today is darker. I'm scared. I didn't hear his voice today. He forgot. He promised. She felt tears burn behind her eyes. This was not just a child's room. It was a prison. And whoever had lived there had waited for someone who never came. She stood abruptly, unable to sit any longer. She climbed the stairs once more, as if pulled by an invisible cord. The attic door creaked softly as she entered. The miniature house waited in silence, its tiny doorway a dark mouth swallowing the dim light. Gennady, who had returned earlier to finish some measurements, stood near one of the beams, examining the structure. He glanced up when she entered. "You found something?" She nodded weakly and handed him the notebook. He read several lines, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing moment. This wasn't just a hiding place, he murmured. It was a long-term room. Someone lived here because they weren't allowed to leave. Marina felt the truth settle heavily around her. It was her son, she whispered. My husband. And his brother. The words felt foreign, as though she were telling someone else's story, not her own. Gennady studied her expression before nodding slowly. Maybe. But we need more than guesswork. He moved toward the far wall of the tiny room. There might be something else. Marina followed him, watching as he gently probed the baseboards. After a few attempts, he found a narrow seam in the wood. Carefully, using a flat tool, he pried it open. A small wooden box slid out, coated in dust. Marina felt her breath catch. Gennady opened the box. Inside were fragments of old clothing, a rusted spoon, small folded scraps of paper, and drawings that made Marina's heart twist painfully. A child, alone, drawing the same figure again and again, an older boy holding his hand. Her husband. The realization struck with the force of a blow. Her husband had known. He had remembered. He had lived with this guilt his entire life, and he had never spoken of it, not once in all their years together. Marina sank to the floor, her legs trembling, and pressed a hand against her mouth to stifle the sob rising from her chest. Gennady knelt beside her, placing the box gently on the floor. This truth was buried for a reason, he said. But now that it's out, you're not alone in facing it. Marina nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She felt the house around her shift, as though moved by a breath she could not hear. She sensed, with unsettling certainty, that whatever had lived, whatever had waited in that tiny room, had not entirely left. Later that night, as Marina tried to sleep, the wind outside rose sharply, rattling the windows. She closed her eyes and listened, trying to steady her breath. But then she heard its slow, deliberate steps moving across the attic floor, not loud, not urgent, small, familiar. A child's steps, pacing the wooden boards above her room. Her heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to run to Artyom, to get him out of the house, but her body felt frozen under the weight of fear and something else, an instinctive understanding. Whoever had waited in that tiny room had not yet fully left this world of memories, and Marina sensed she was now entwined with the truth in ways she could not untangle. She lay awake until dawn, listening to the house breathe, knowing that the darkest parts of the story were still hidden in the shadows, waiting for her to uncover them. The attic had given her only the beginning. The truth, the full truth, still lay somewhere deeper waiting, just as the child had once waited, for someone to finally see it. Marina awoke just before sunrise, though she could not say she had truly slept. The house felt heavier than ever, as though the weight of the previous night's footsteps had seeped into the walls, thickening the air. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the silence above her. It was a tense silence, the kind that followed a confession or a revelation, when the world itself seemed to pause and hold its breath. She finally rose, her body stiff with exhaustion, and moved quietly through the house. The floorboards were cold beneath her feet, and the faint white light of dawn cast long, uncertain shadows across the hallway. When she passed Artyom's door and heard the soft rhythm of his breathing, she felt a fragile sense of purpose settle into place. Whatever truth still hid inside the attic had to be faced, not only for herself, but for her son, who had unknowingly slept beneath the echoes of a tragedy no child should ever feel. She found Gennady already awake in the kitchen. He sat at the table, a thermos cup steaming before him. He looked as if he had not slept either. When he met her eyes, there was no surprise in his expression, only a quiet understanding, as though he too sensed that the next steps would be heavier than any they had taken before. "It's time," Marina said. Her voice was calm, steadier than she expected. He nodded, rose from his seat, and followed her toward the attic stairway without a word. Each step up toward the attic felt like approaching the heart of a long-buried wound. When she pushed open the attic hatch, the air inside felt colder than the rest of the house, the dim morning light falling across the tiny white facade like a shroud. The miniature house seemed more fragile now, the peeling paint catching the early light in thin, trembling lines. Marina stepped inside the attic and paused. A soft shift of air rippled along the rafters, so faint she might have imagined it. The shadows clung stubbornly to the corners, though the window vents allowed in a thin sliver of daybreak. She wasn't sure whether it was the cold or her own anticipation that caused her hands to tremble as she approached the miniature doorway. Gennady stayed close behind her, his presence anchoring her as she stepped into the small room one last time. Inside, everything was exactly as they had left it. The bed, the toys, the notebooks, untouched and unmoved. But Marina felt a different energy in the room now. It no longer felt like a forgotten space. It felt aware, as if it had been waiting for her. She approached the small bed again, her fingers trailing lightly over the thin striped blanket. She wondered how many nights the child had lain here, listening to footsteps that never belonged to the one he hoped for. The thought made her chest ache. She looked back at Gennady. "There must be more," she said. "Something we haven't found yet." He nodded and knelt beside the wall where he had discovered the wooden box the previous day. He pressed along the boards carefully, testing for any hidden seams. Marina crouched on the opposite side, running her hands along the lower baseboards. The wood felt brittle beneath her touch, as if time itself had softened it. And then her fingers brushed a thin line, a nearly invisible gap between two boards. Her breath caught. "Here," she whispered. Gennady moved beside her. Using the flat tool again, he gently pried at the seam. The board resisted at first, then gave way with a faint crack. Behind it, they found another cavity. Marina's pulse quickened as she leaned forward. Inside lay a small cloth pouch tied with a faded ribbon. Her fingers shook as she reached in and retrieved it. The fabric was stiff with age, the ribbon frayed. She untied it slowly, half afraid of what she might find. Inside were papers, yellowed and brittle. She unfolded the first page carefully. It was a letter, written in a trembling, childish hand. I wanted to leave. He promised he would help me. He said we would run one night when they were sleeping. I waited. I waited many nights. But he didn't come. Marina felt her throat tighten painfully. She unfolded another scrap. It held only a drawing this time. A tiny figure curled in a corner, knees tucked against chest, surrounded by tall walls. She closed her eyes. There was no mistaking what these were. These were the last thoughts of a child who had endured loneliness beyond anything she could fathom. She sifted through the remaining scraps, each one bearing silent testimony to a life spent in confinement. But the final piece made her blood run cold. It was a note, written in darker pencil, the pressure heavy, the script larger and more desperate. I don't feel good. It's too dark. If someone finds this, tell him. I waited. Marina's hands trembled uncontrollably. She could barely hold the paper. The room felt suddenly smaller, suffocating her with the weight of the forgotten suffering imbued in every board, every corner. Gennady gently took the fragile scrap from her hands, reading it silently, his jaw clenched with quiet anger. This boy didn't leave this room alive, he said. He never had a chance. Marina nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. She felt a grief that wasn't hers, a grief inherited through the dust and silence, carried by the walls that had witnessed everything. She rose slowly, her legs weak. We need to know, she whispered. We need to know where he ended up. Gennady stood with her, his gaze steady. He moved to the center of the room and tapped the floorboards thoughtfully. If they hid him here, he said, they might have hidden him further beneath. Marina felt the air thicken. You think? I think there might be another space, something below. He began to gently remove items from the center of the room, clearing a space large enough to kneel. Marina watched anxiously as he examined the boards more closely. Then he found it, a subtle discoloration, a square outline in the floor where one board was slightly offset. "Help me lift it," he said. Together they pried at the edges. The board resisted, as though it had not been moved for decades. But finally, it loosened, creaking upward to reveal a hollow cavity beneath the miniature floor. A chill seeped out from the darkness below, colder than any air in the attic. Marina leaned forward cautiously. Inside the cavity lay fragments of bone, small and pale, arranged haphazardly, as though someone had hurriedly placed them there long ago. Marina gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth, a sob choking her throat. Her vision blurred with tears, and her breath came in short, sharp bursts. She felt the world around her fall into silence, not the silence of abandonment she felt the day before, but a solemn, mournful quiet, as if the room itself recognized the acknowledgement of its hidden truth. The child's remains had been buried beneath his own prison. Gennady exhaled slowly, closing his eyes. "This is him," he said softly. "This is the boy." Marina fell to her knees, overcome by the crushing sorrow of the revelation. Her husband had lived his entire life, knowing what lay above their heads, knowing what he had failed to do, the brother he had left behind. The guilt he had carried must have been unbearable. Every day, every night, he had walked through this house with that weight pressing on him. And he had never said a word. When Marina finally found the strength to stand, she knew what needed to happen next. This child deserved the dignity he had been denied. His story needed to be told, not left to rot beneath dusty boards. Gennady squeezed her shoulder gently. "We call the authorities," he said. She nodded. "But not before we gather everything," she said. "Every scrap of paper, every drawing, everything that tells his story." They collected the items carefully, placing each in separate envelopes. Marina handled them with reverence, as though they were relics of a life almost erased. Once they had gathered everything, Gennady descended the ladder to call the authorities, leaving Marina alone in the attic. For a moment she stood still, letting the cold air wash over her. She walked into the small room again and looked around one last time. The sadness here was vast and old, like a shadow cast by a sun long gone. But beneath that sadness, she felt something shift. A calmness, a quiet that did not feel like suffering, but like release. As she stepped back into the main attic, she heard a soft creak, gentler than before, like a small footstep followed by silence. She turned, expecting to see Gennady, but the attic was empty, and yet she felt no fear. Only a brief warmth that passed through her, settling lightly against her heart. Later, after the authorities had arrived, after careful hands had retrieved the small bones, after the dark history of the house had been exposed to the light, Marina found herself standing in the yard with Artyom. Snowflakes drifted down lazily from the pale sky, settling on her coat, her hair, her cheeks. Artyom held her hand tightly. "Mama," he said softly, "the house is quieter now." Marina looked down at him. "Do you feel better?" "Yes," he said. "I don't hear the little steps anymore." He hesitated. "But last night, he wasn't sad, not like before." Marina felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were different, softer, brighter. She knelt in the snow and wrapped her arms around her son. "He's at peace now," she whispered. He finally found his way out. The days that followed were filled with slow, steady healing. The authorities handled the remains with respect, ensuring the child's identity would be confirmed. Newspapers whispered about the dark secret of the old Lavina house, but Marina paid little attention. She focused on repairing the home, turning it from a place of buried sorrow into something warm, open, and filled with life. Gennady continued coming by, first to finish the repairs, then simply to check on them. His presence became a quiet reassurance, a reminder that even in the aftermath of tragedy, kindness could take root. Marina decided to remove the miniature structure carefully, preserving certain parts of it for evidence, but she could not bring herself to destroy the small door. She kept it, refusing to throw away the symbol of a life that had been hidden too long. Instead, she hung it on the hallway wall, an unspoken memorial, a reminder that truth, once revealed, carried its own kind of light. As winter faded and early spring crept into the air, Marina felt the house breathe differently. The oppressive heaviness had lifted. The nights were quiet. No more footsteps. No more whispers. No more sorrow pressing down from the attic. One evening she stood beneath the open sky, watching snow melt drip from the eaves. She closed her eyes and felt a soft breeze brush against her face, gentle as a child's hand. In that moment, she understood something profound. The house was no longer haunted. It had finally spoken its truth, and she had listened. And because of that, it was free. She opened her eyes and exhaled slowly, feeling peace settle into her bones. The story that had once been buried in the attic was no longer a weight, but a memory. One that would never fully fade, but one that no longer held sorrow within its silence. And for the first time since she had moved into the old house, Marina felt that she truly belonged there, in a home that had finally learned how to breathe again. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel, watch the next videos, and share this one with someone who needs to see it.